Welcome back to the conference on Rethinking Solidarity by the Bavarian American Academy. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the opening keynote of this conference tonight. Let me start by saying that we feel honored to host such a renowned and distinguished speaker who is well versed in the current political landscape of the US and beyond. So it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor Pippa Norris. Welcome.
Thank you.
Pippa Norris is a comparative political scientist and the Paul F. McGuire Lecturer in Comparative Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Before she joined Harvard a couple of decades ago, she taught at Northumberland University and at Edinburgh University after having earned her degrees in politics and philosophy at Warwick and the London School of Economics and Political Science. In the meantime, she has had appointments also at the University of Sydney, at Columbia University, the University of Cape Town, the Australian National University, Otago University, New Zealand, and universities in Europe, Oslo and East Anglia. Professor Norris is the founding director of the Electoral Integrity Project, which was founded in 2012. It focuses on questions such as international standards of electoral integrity, why and how elections do or do not meet such standards, and what can be done about this. Work for which she was also awarded with the Brown Democracy Medal in 2016 by the Penn State University's McCourtney Institute. Professor Norris is also the director of the Global Party Survey, the aim of which it is to identify and compare political parties around the world as to their ideology, policy positions, and rhetoric. She is the co-director of the TrustGov project, examining public trust in governance around the world, a theme very close to the topic of her talk today. Professor Norris is an executive member of the World Values Survey, founded in 1981 by Ronald Inglehart, monitoring social, political, economic, religious, and cultural values of people in the world. While these commitments already reflect several of the research topics dear to her heart, the latter also includes comparative approaches toward democracy and processes of democratization, political institutions and behavior, public opinion, political communication, and not to forget, gender politics. Besides this already impressive list of commitments, she has also filled various high-profile positions in different professional associations, such as both the American and the International Political Science Associations, as well as the Political Science Association of the UK. The list I'm talking about also includes public service, for example, as consultant to many international bodies such as the UN, UNESCO, Council of Europe, the OSCE, and the World Bank, to name just a few. Professor Norris is the author and co-author of more than 20 books. She is the editor of almost 30 books and the author of a long list of articles and chapters. Above all else, she is a renowned scholar. Her work has been published in more than a dozen languages, just more than a dozen languages. The title of her most recent books are Cultural Backlash, Trump, Brexit, and Authoritarian Populism, co-authored with Ronald Inglehart, came out with Cambridge UP, and Electoral Integrity in America, Securing Democracy, edited with Sarah Cameron and Thomas Winter, published with Oxford in 2019. Her current book project is titled In Praise of Skepticism, Trust, but Verify, scheduled for publication with Oxford this summer, and we have the chance to hear more about this in just a few moments. Several of her books have also been awarded prestigious prizes For example, the 2018 George H. Hallett Book Award for Political Recruitment, Gender, Race and Class in the British Parliament, and the 2016 Choice Outstanding Academic Title for Why Elections Fail. Other honors she received include the Samuel Eldersveld Lifetime Career Achievement Award in 2020 by the American Political Science Association, the Charles Merriam Award also by the APSA 2019, and the Sir Isaiah Berlin Prize in 2017. I could go on and on and on. Professor Norris has a serious investment in science communication, and if you look at her Twitter account, you will learn something new every day. Since 2018, Pippa Norris is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she has received multiple honorary doctorates from Leuphana University Lüneburg, the universities of Bergen and Warwick and Edinburgh. Dear Pippa Norris, I know for a fact that your calendar is bursting, and I want to express my deep gratitude that you are joining us tonight as a keynote speaker, and that you will share your thoughts with us coming out of your new project on trust. Let me welcome you once again. Thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Paul, and such a generous introduction. And it's a pleasure in particular to be with German scholars, since so much work on trust has been done by scholars in your country, and excellent work in terms of thinking both about solidarity and how solidarity relates to trust as well. So just like we're thinking about what it means to have solidarity in the overall view, I'd like us to think about what it means to have trust. And I want us to revise some of the notions that we normally have in praise of skepticism. Now, let's think about what we're covering here. And it's a book which we mentioned, and I can't obviously go through the whole book, so I'm going to focus on the theory, which is both normative and empirical, and help us to think about what it means to trust, whether it's in society, whether it's in politics and government, or whether it's in the international community. So I'll focus on the first couple of chapters and a little bit of the evidence, but clearly there's too much evidence and that can wait for another day. But the book basically sets out the arguments and then investigates a series of causes in the theory about what causes skeptical trust, and then talks about how we can actually strengthen trust or skeptical trust, which I argue is the most important aspect. And the argument I'm going to make, as I alluded to in the fable in the title, is about the frog and the scorpion. And fables are something which, of course, Germany is famous for. This is the one which is very familiar. It's taught to people in schools. And it's about the frog that wanted to cross the pond. And a scorpion came along and said to the frog, "Carry me on your back, and I want to get to the other side." And the frog said, "Well, why should I trust you?" And the scorpion replied, "Well, if I were to sting you, then of course we'd both die, we'd both drown." So the frog said, "Okay, that makes sense." The scorpion hopped on board. They went across the pond halfway. The scorpion basically stung the frog and they both sunk. And the frog said, "Why?" And the scorpion said, "It's my nature." So what we're going to try and do today is persuade you that trust in our basic understanding with many, many authors over many decades needs to be challenged normatively, because many people claim it has inevitably beneficial consequences, whether it's for society, whether it's for the economy, whether it's for building community, whether it's for building the European Union and international bonds. And we need to rethink our explanations about the evidence, and particularly whether people can make informed and accurate and reliable judgments about trustworthy relationships. What I'm going to argue in the talk is that there are many common errors. Just like we underestimate all sorts of risks or overestimate all sorts of risks, for example, about whether vaccines are going to prevent the COVID pandemic, or whether cigarettes lead to cancer, or whether climate change is raising heat indexes around the world, we make perceptual errors all the time. And I think in our areas of trustworthiness, when we try to work out, can we trust a lawyer? Can we trust a doctor? Can we trust a government? Can we trust politicians? There's two types of errors. One is cynicism, and that's widespread and that's well known. And we're always talking about the fact that you can have a beneficial and a benevolent actor that people don't trust. People, anti-vaxxers, don't trust the vaccine, even though science says it works, it's safe, it'll save your life. But the opposite is an equal problem, and that's one which is totally underestimated in the literature, and that's compliant trust. And compliant trust is very common around the world, and is essentially where you're trusting a stranger, or you're trusting an actor, or an agency, or an institution when they're untrustworthy. When you trust a con man, when you trust a demagogue, when you trust those who are going to basically do you harm, that's equally problematic. And the reasons why these errors occur, I'm going to argue, is the result of two different factors, essentially. Let's have a parsimonious model. It's about your individual cognitive skills. You have to have information. It's complex to make decisions, particularly about distant decisions that you're not familiar with, where you have no experience. And it's also an information environment. So it's your society around you. Is it open? Do you have different sources of information? Can you have different ways to think about an issue? And so where you get both of those, you get more skeptical trust. And I'm concluding that the risks of compliant trust are very common, particularly in many authoritarian regimes, but not just there. And the risks are underestimated, and they are risks for society. For example, think about the backsliding in democracy. A large part of that is trusting strongman leaders who promise that they will represent you, when in fact they're going to be corrupt or incompetent, or they're going to basically act in ways which are against your interests. And they're problematic for individuals, because you're trusting somebody to do something or to help you and to act in a benevolent way and to be competent, and yet they're not. So let's set out the argument. Let's start with the theory and the theoretical framework, the research design and the evidence. And I'm going to draw on widespread evidence from around the world using the World Value Survey, over 115 countries, a little bit of the results, and then the conclusions. So think about trust. And often we're multidisciplinary, and we often pick one particular aspect of trust. So sociologists and economists and social psychologists often focus on social trust, interpersonal trust, trust between people, friends, neighbors, within local communities. Work on Social Capital by Bob Putnam, for example. Others, however, in political science and international relations will focus more on institutions, agencies of the nation state and civil society. Do we trust parties? Do we trust parliaments? Do we trust elected leaders? And this is another common approach. And then lastly, there's trust in international communities and global governance. And again, cultural sociology, comparative politics, and international relations says, for example, has trust in the European Union strengthened, or has it declined? What's the trust that we have between different governments, for example, between the United States and China, or the United States and Russia, and between different peoples? How far do Germans trust the French or the English or other groups? So all of those are important. And what tends to happen is we get very fragmented in the field. So people take one area and they'll only focus on that without thinking of the broader ramifications. My book, my thesis is that each of these are related. There's a common concept. And most of the work which has been done in the previous decades, and it's an extensive literature in each of the subfields, has basically said that trust is essentially benevolent and good. And so it's thought to facilitate social cooperation, the way that we can work together to overcome problems of collective goods, to lubricate markets. If we don't have contracts, then if companies trust each other, if people trust brand goods, then that's thought to help economics and economic growth. To strengthen political legitimacy, if you trust your leader and your government, then you're much more likely to obey the law and to comply voluntarily with authoritative regulations. To have international alliances, to be all part of a rules-based international order in which conventions matter, and to generate, therefore, conditions of peace and prosperity. And for solidarity, trust is often seen as the linchpin, the foundation. After all, solidarity is about cooperation amongst peoples and a sense of identity that's joined, and trust is very much part of that core orientation. If so, of course, declining trust is a matter of concern. And so we've got a wide variety of different books and extensive literature. And a lot of it has been in America, Bowling Alone by my colleague Bob Putnam, others which have focused in the Russell Sage Foundation on trust, such as Russell Hardin, Francis Fukuyama in Stanford, and others who thought about the psychology of trust. Similarly, the arguments are being made. A deep reservoir of trust amongst friends strengthens civic engagement, says Bob. Francis Fukuyama, informal trust strengthens opportunities for growth. Erik Ulsiner, generalized trust allows things like charities to work, philanthropies, voluntary goods, and tolerance. But of course, for politics, again, many books, many studies, many scholars. The earliest one, The Crisis of Democracy by the Trilateral Commission, but work more recently on Europe, for example, Caroline van Ham and Jacques Thomasson in the Netherlands on the European Union and the legitimacy crisis, work in America on why people don't trust Congress, and my own book 2 decades ago on critical citizens. And again, the consensus ever since Armand and Weber in the 1960s is that confidence and trust is one of the things which allows democracy to work and the civic culture. And if we don't trust other parties, we get polarization. Think about the situation in Congress right now, where there's not even any clear cooperation on basic rules of the game about democracy and elections, gridlock, and rising skepticism. We hear that all the time. And there've been periodic waves. It's not something new. It's not something that's just about Trump or authoritarian populism. There was an argument in the 60s. There's been arguments in the 1990s, and again in the contemporary era where the lack of trust is associated with populism. But what is trust? What's the actual concept? And there are 3 theories which are common. So psychological theories, and Erik Ulsiner has advanced this, but again, it has a long tradition, is that essentially it's about what you're born with. It's an inherent characteristic or a personality predisposition. So some people, it's argued, are born with all sorts of personality characteristics. They might, for example, have characteristics which are agreeable, or which are ones which are social, or which are to do with cooperation. But whether or not you trust, it's thought, is also an inherent characteristic, inherited from your parents or biological determinants. If so, of course, there's very little that can be done about it if it's inherited. Sociology, however, comes at it with a slightly different perspective, and it looks at societies, not just individuals. And for example, work by Ron Inglehart, my colleague, said, essentially it's about a learned characteristic. So if you're in Sweden, if you're in Germany, if you're in Scandinavia, where governments work and where societies are safe, and there's a strong trusting culture. By contrast, if you're brought up in countries like Latin American countries with high levels of crime, or drug cartels, or problems of instability, or governments which are corrupt, in a Peru, or in a Mexico, or in a Venezuela, then you learn not to trust other people or the government or other institutions. And again, in this sense, it's sticky. It's not meant to change overnight. It's meant to change gradually through generational processes, but to be something that is socially acquired in your childhood. Now, both of those have implications. The argument I'm going to make is based on the rational choice theory. And what this says is that trustworthiness is what we need to focus on, not trust. Trust is about the individual and a predisposition. Trustworthiness is about a relationship. It's not about me and you, it's about us. And I'm arguing that it's a delegative relationship. What I mean by that is that it's about principles and agents, which is a rational choice classic assumption. Principles expect, in other words, they believe or they have certain confidence in agents, those who are acting on their behalf. So it could be a lawyer or a doctor or a scholar. It could be a scientific authority. It could be an institution like public services or a department of state or a political party in government. Or it could be an international agency like the United Nations and its branches, the World Health Organization. So principles expect agents to act on their behalf to achieve certain outcomes. What do you want to do? What's the goals? Is it to get rid of the pandemic? Is it to bring down unemployment? Is it to improve international cooperation? Whatever the goals are, you expect them to act on your behalf to achieve this. And there's elements of risk. It's not certain by any means. Information is complex. Judging whether or not they can achieve those goals is difficult. But you've got to trust them. You've got to feel that they can act on your behalf better than you can do so yourself. And so it's a relationship where you have core beliefs, you're investing things in other people, in other agents, in other groups. Now, to maximize your interest and to minimize your risks, obviously we should only trust those who are trustworthy. But how do I know that? Now, if it's friends, if it's a company I've dealt with for years, if it's a personal relationship, then I've got experience. But in many cases, I don't. How do I know whether the scientists who are telling me about COVID are ones who are well qualified or who know what they're talking about? And what happens if there's two scientists who disagree, or if there's a dispute? Issues like climate change or issues about how we improve the economy are complex. And we've got imperfect information to judge people and agencies and actions. So skeptics, and I'm arguing in favor of skepticism, a long-standing philosophical tradition, judge trustworthiness by searching for reliable information. How have people behaved in the past? How have agencies worked? And what I'm looking for are three things in particular. Competency, that means to say, can agents deliver? Do they have the capacity, the skills, the knowledge? Integrity, meaning their honesty, and impartiality, meaning that they'll act on behalf of their principles, not on their own side. But individuals might still fail. So I also need to have some collective accountability, and that means guardrails protecting against bad actors. So I might well feel that, for example, for a particular operation, I trust a surgeon, I trust them with my life. But of course, if they fail for any reason, if there's medical malpractice, then they can get struck off the medical board by a professional board. An election provides accountability against an incompetent government. And other mechanisms of oversight provide mechanisms against actors who are corrupt or who are in some ways self-interested and not acting in the public good. So we need to minimize risks and maximize benefits by delegation through skepticism, not by blind faith, not by believing in trust just because we're being brought up to believe it, not just blind confidence, but skeptical judgments. Now, how do we trust but verify? How do we get information about whether somebody's trustworthy, especially in high-risk situations? So I'm arguing two things matter: past reputation, how have they performed on a series of different actions in the past? Are they, again, competent, altruistic, and honest? And accountability guardrails, but there are lots of errors in judgment. And particularly if we rely simply on our feelings, our gut instincts, or motivated reasoning, where we work backwards. For example, if I'm a Republican, I might trust Trump because I believe that the party has certain values and he stands for those. And so it's a backwards relationship. Or selective perceptions. I find those areas of an agency which has worked and I project from that. I don't look at the errors that they've had in the past, or habitual loyalties, or disinformation, which is so replete, or misinformation, or I have no knowledge, etc. So too much trust is a problem, just as too little trust is. Now, how do we think about that? Well, again, here's a little typology which works to actually explain and to make us think about these concepts. On the one hand, we have going across the top, the trust by the principles. Is it high or is it low? Are you greatly trusting or not trusting? Then you also have how the agents, whoever they are, or however that collective agency is, performed. Is it negative or is it positive? Have they done what they say? And so you get two categories. And normatively, I'm arguing that we get skeptical mistrust and skeptical trust. Both of these are positive. Normally we think that trust is good, and so we go for skeptical trust where the performance is good and people are trusting. But skeptical mistrust, which I used to term years ago critical citizens, is equally positive because if you're in a country, for example, where the government is corrupt, you should not trust it. If you're in an autocracy where there's very limited rights and very limited freedoms and very little form of accountability, you should not trust those actors. And the opposite view, on the other, is both compliant trust and cynical mistrust. And again, I don't need to rehearse to you the problems of cynical mistrust, where you don't trust an authority, even though they're acting in your good, in your public service. But where you have compliant trust, it's blind faith, that's equally problematic. Now, it could still mean things like voluntary compliance with the law or going along with regulations, but it's ultimately unhealthy because it can fail, because it's not based on information, it's not based on reliable knowledge. And the sources of conceptual error, your analytical capacities. Formal education is one because it gives you cognitive skills, it gives you knowledge, it gives you interest, it gives you a way of critically analyzing the media and the media information. And then experience and age can also add to that level of capacity to judge. And then also the task environment and the information sources. Are you in an open or a closed information society? So think about citizens in North Korea, for example, who have very positive evaluations of their leaders and believe that their government is being effective. Well, clearly, when state is controlling and censoring alternative views, where there's very few other sources of independent information in a closed society, that's problematic for your judgments. And that's really important when we come to some countries where trust is high for reasons, but performance is low. Freedom of the press is important, government accountability, government transparency, and so on. So the model says judgments of trustworthiness can be measured by performance indices. And so to empirically define and operationalize this, what we need to look at is the relationship between my judgments and how that agent or agency has performed. How have there been certain policy outputs? And what's the performance of accountability mechanisms? And just to unpack that a bit, what we mean is, say you're looking at the government in Germany and you're saying, is it trustworthy? Or the party in power? Or other indicators of other agencies? What you're looking for is, are there good measures of policy output? For example, has the economy improved? Has unemployment gone down? Has welfare got better? Has the pandemic control been effective? And then, do elections work? Is Parliament, is the Bundestag holding the government to account? Are there mechanisms of oversight? But of course, it's not a direct relationship. You could well have positive indicators, and yet people still think the judgment isn't working. So we have to have in the full model public perceptions. Indices by themselves don't tell us anything unless the public is aware of them, unless the public feels that they're trustworthy and that therefore they have to be judgments of competency about the government or about the central actors and of effectiveness of the guardrails. And your information from your individual competencies and your societal information will help. They'll both strengthen public perceptions. If you don't have the information, if you're not aware of them, then you might well think things are happening or misinterpret the information. And finally, there's a feedback loop. So judgments of trustworthiness are then going to have a consequence on performance. Now, what's the research designed to operationalize this? Well, quite simply, what we've got is to measure first levels of public trust in agents. And that's conventional, that's what we do all the time. We look at Gallup measures, we look at the European Social Survey, or what I'm going to use is the World Values Survey. And we can measure levels of trust in the press, in the media, in public officials, in business, in banks, in NGOs, etc. Then what we have to look at is subjective perceptions and objective indices of the performance and the accountability measures. For example, here we can look at things like the Varieties of Democracy project, which looks at varieties of ways in which different institutions work. For example, are elections clean and fair? Are the judiciary independent of partisan influence? How far has there been effective mechanisms in terms of transparency where parliaments hold the government accountable for their actions? And skeptical trust in practice, therefore, is measured very simply by the relationship, the correlation between your level of public trust and performance. Well, in theory, it's simple. In practice, it's far more difficult, of course, to demonstrate that. The data is from the World Value Survey and the European Value Survey. There are now 7 waves going from 1981 with a limited range of 22 countries through to 2021. By the way, I'm part of this, and fieldwork remains somewhat delayed for the final wave because COVID has delayed certain countries. Nevertheless, the data set covers 115 diverse societies and regimes around the world if we pool all of the waves and all of the surveys. And we have great measures from the very beginning on interpersonal trust, how we trust each other, institutional confidence, and trust in global governance. And my own project, which we mentioned earlier, the TrustGov project, added new batteries, including in 9 diverse autocracies. Because one of the problems is in survey research is expanded enormously, but it's been primarily conducted within liberal democracies. And that's a limited universe. We can't generalize from those. It's very different if you live in a failed state. Think about a country like Haiti, where the president was just assassinated, and the problems which they've had, where the state was decimated by natural disasters and by weak government. So we need to really cover the world and cover strong states which are very repressive. Think about a Russia or a China, as well as the countries like Germany and Sweden with effective liberal democracies. This is the coverage, and Germany has always been very much central to this part of this with Chris Welzel. But as you can see, it now covers many parts of the world, although not as many as we'd like in sub-Saharan Africa. Some, but we are limited because it's based on funding, and many of the countries which are included are those that can fund surveys, or there are countries which we've found some central sources, but we've managed to expand over the years. Now, here are some of the items, and we have different types of agents. And what this shows is simply a factor analysis where people are asked about confidence. For example, in global governance, we have questions about the World Bank. Do you have confidence in NATO, the World Trade Organization, and so on? And all of those come together so we can have a global governance scale. In national governments, we have the institutions here like parliaments, parties, elections. We have questions about NGOs and others in the private sector like universities and banks. About traditional groups, the armed forces, labor unions, the press, and we have 2 types of social trust. Trust in outgroups, people of other nationalities, trust of in-groups. How far do you trust people like your family? In addition, one question which is always asked is, can we trust the data? Especially when we're covering authoritarian regimes, how do we know whether or not that's actually reliable? There could easily be all sorts of ideas about repression and censorship. So just technically, we do include also some list count survey experiments. And what these do in the World Values Survey, where these are carried, is they split the sample into 2. And we ask everybody a direct question: how much do you trust your leader, your head of state? And then we ask them an indirect question. And this is often asked of socially sensitive matters, not just of trust, for example, about violence in the home or domestic violence, or about race. So we ask people in 6 countries in a split sample. On the one hand, we ask them the first question. I'm going to read a list of world leaders. How many do you generally trust, including Angela Merkel, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping. And then in the second one, we ask them, and then we include the name of the head of state. So we don't ask them directly to mention that they trust their head of state. Instead, they can say 3, 4, 5, whatever it is. The difference between those 2 groups in a country measures response bias. Here's some results, and I won't go into them in great detail, but there are countries which are all authoritarian. Nicaragua, just arrested opposition leaders, the Philippines with Duterte, Iran with the Supreme Council, Ethiopia, and so on. And we have the question, how many names in the 4 list do people trust? How many do they trust when they say they add the name of their own head of state? The difference, which is the indirect measure. We have a direct measure of head of trust, and then the response bias. Quite simply, there's a lot of response bias in all of these countries, as you might expect. In Zimbabwe, for example, when asked indirectly about trust, 36% trust their head of state. That's the difference between the control and the treatment group. When we ask them directly, 55% say they trust their head of state, meaning there's a 19% response bias. And it's even worse in a country like Ethiopia. So we do have to trust all of our evidence in authoritarian states with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, it's most likely that the response bias is greatest when we're asking about the leader or the party in control, and probably is less when we're asking about other institutions. For example, how far do you trust banks? Or how far do you trust environmental movements? Or how far do you trust each other? So there is some response bias, but that's often the case in many sensitive issues. But it's an issue that we need to think about when we're interpreting the data. What's the results? Let's look at the results. And I'm not going to look at them all. I'm going to give you a little snapshot just to show you some of the picture that exists. Firstly, social trust. So what we've got here is just the country average in terms of how far they trust the in-group. That's the family and the friends, people you know. Is it low, which is on the left, or is it high on the right? That's the horizontal axis. Then on the vertical axis, how far do you trust others? For example, people who have different faith, different country, or strangers. And this is just to show what the data looks like before we do any analysis. And we can see that a number of countries, including Germany, tend to be trusting of both. But even more so in Sweden, in Norway, and Finland, they trust each other, whether it's people they know or people they don't know. And we can see many affluent Northern European countries fall into this, along with others. The United States is there, Canada is there, Finland is there, Argentina is there, and so on. But in the opposite quadrant, we can immediately, some countries trust neither strangers nor friends, and there are high levels of distrust amongst countries like those in Peru, Ecuador, Nicaragua, one of our cases which we focus on, Mexico, Brazil, Romania, a whole bunch of countries in Latin America, a whole bunch of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and by the way, not necessarily the poorest countries in the sample by any means. We have developing countries which are poorer, but there does seem to be a regional effect in terms of who trusts and who doesn't. And then we have some countries where people trust each other as friends, but not strangers. Egypt is classically the case there, China, Pakistan, Iraq, some of the countries, therefore, in the Middle East, some of the Muslim countries, some of the countries in South Asia. Confidence in parties, confidence in governments, again, descriptively, starts to show you the data. And immediately what this does from a global perspective is explains why trust per se, or confidence per se, is not necessarily a positive thing. So let's look at the pattern. And here what we have is confidence in government on the vertical axis, whether it's low or high, confidence in political parties, whether it's low or whether it's high. And what we can see is some countries which are very low on both, Tunisia, which has emerged after long years of Gaddafi, but after the Arab Spring, with a democracy which is trying to establish and institutionalize, but is still somewhat incomplete. A Haiti, a Peru, a Libya, many of the countries which have had transitions and instability in recent years, fragile states, often a Yemen, for example, with international conflict spilling into its borders and civil war. Countries like Romania, Serbia, Argentina, sometimes middle income, but still obviously countries which have got low trust in both parties and in government. Poorly institutionalized, poorly consolidated as a civic culture. But then let's look at the opposite side. And immediately what you see is it's not the affluent countries like we saw when we looked at social trust. It's not the Western democracies. It's not the Scandinavian countries. It's Uzbekistan, Vietnam, China, Tajikistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, just been destabilized by a military coup d'etat, about to descend potentially into civil war between Democrats who do not want to lose their newfound freedom and the army, and with the groups like the police in the middle. Singapore, Kazakhstan. So you can see immediately why my argument that high trust in government and high trust in parties is not necessarily associated with liberal democracy or with values of governments, which you could argue are good government, or with trustworthiness. Now, maybe some of those you can classify as good government, depending on the criteria. For example, China has lifted millions out of poverty, and it's produced tremendous economic growth for its citizens, becoming the second biggest economy in the world in terms of GDP. And yet, very repressive for dissidents, very problematic for human rights, and very problematic for some of the countries in the region, like Taiwan. And we can see middle countries are ones which are neither high nor low. So the United States is moderate in confidence in political parties, comparatively speaking, and moderate in its confidence in government. And you can see a number of other countries around there, like the United Kingdom, like Spain, and so on, which are all part of that group. So confidence per se can be problematic, whether it's very high or very low, but what matters is not so much what level you have, but the relationship between confidence and trust and performance. So let me skip on, because we only have 5 minutes, to the broader patterns. Firstly, is it the case that levels of trust in national government, in your state institutions, and here I have a scale where I pulled together 6 different institutions, is related to standard indicators of good governance and liberal democracy? And this is all the countries which are pooled from the World Values Survey. And I have a narrower scale, which is just the 4 institutions for comparison. And these are the institutions such as Parliament, government, political parties, and the public sector. And immediately what you can see is that there is a relationship between these indicators and, for example, economic development, levels of economic growth, GDP per capita. There's also a significant relationship between these trust indicators and our indicators from the World Bank on good governance, things like government effectiveness, stability, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption. But none of these indicators are particularly strong, even though they're statistically significant. They're not a 50%, they're 0.30, maximum 0.25. So a large level of the variation is not being captured. In other words, a lot of people may trust even though the government may be ineffective, and some people may not trust even though the government is effective. And if we look at the liberal democracy indicators, they're negative and weak, just as we saw China having a high level of trust in their government, and yet, of course, low levels of liberal democracy through things like the VDEM, the Variety of Democracy Index, and a negative relationship. People are more trusting of governments which are less democratic, which have less freedom of expression. And so that again emphasizes that the information environment is really important. So again, this illustrates the deviations. There is a relationship between confidence in your national government and government effectiveness, but many countries fall across the line, whether it's a Zimbabwe or whether it's a Canada, a Sweden, a Netherlands, and Austria. So what's going on? Well, let's think about the key thing which I mentioned earlier. And this illustrates how it can be related, and then we can come to the conclusions. So what we've got here is the relationship between the Good Government Index, which pulls together those 6 dimensions combined from the World Bank Institute. It means control of corruption, government effectiveness, political stability, and so on. That goes along the bottom. And then the vertical axis is confidence in the United Nations, the National Parliament, the courts, the police, and the civil service. And what you can see is that you do get, therefore, these 4 quadrants, just like we predicted in the typology. And so we get some countries where there's skeptical mistrust. Haiti, again, as I mentioned earlier, the president has just been assassinated. The prime minister's taken over. There's instability on the streets. There's high levels of corruption. There's high levels of fragmentation, poor capacity to deliver services. A case like Yemen, a case like Guatemala, high levels of corruption, Bolivia, Venezuela, with Maduro, Ukraine, destabilized by long years of conflict between the West and the East, Libya, Iraq, Russia, Brazil, Mexico. So all of these are countries which have problems of governance, and the public is rightfully, I'd argue, mistrustful of government institutions. They don't think it works. By contrast, the opposite in the top right-hand corner, skeptical trust. Singapore, government works. It is problematic in terms of democracy, but nevertheless, it controls corruption, produces economic growth, high levels of law and order and stability and so on. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Estonia, Japan, Austria, all of those fall in that. The United States and the United Kingdom and Australia, interestingly, and New Zealand, all fall slightly below what you will term the consociational European countries, but still they're there. Although the United States is lower, much lower than many of the Scandinavian countries, both in performance, according to the World Bank, and in terms of trust. And as you would expect, some Central and Eastern European countries fall into the cynical mistrust. In other words, the World Bank thinks that a government in Slovenia or in the Czech Republic is working quite well according to these standards: control of corruption, government effectiveness, middle income countries with a strong state bureaucracy, but it's not a country where there's a high level of trust. Now, you can argue that's a legacy of the past, or you can argue it's partly to do with the politics. For example, the Czech Republic and the role of the Law and Justice Party, Hungary, and the role of Viktor Orban and the Fidesz Party, Spain, Poland. So those are one category, and then compliant trust. Now, the compliant trust is the category which I'm emphasizing most, because this is the group that's really not even seen in the literature. When we're talking about rethinking solidarity, we have to rethink trust. China, Bangladesh, Uzbekistan, the Philippines, India under Modi, Indonesia, Turkey under Erdogan, Iran under the Supreme Council, Zimbabwe, where Jacob Zuma has just been arrested, Thailand, where there was a military coup d'etat. So in those countries, the public has more trust in their government, particularly exemplified by China there, than the World Bank index of their performance in terms of good governance. So what explains this and the position of these groups? And I won't go into the detail of the evidence, but broadly speaking, it's the information environment, how much you have plural sources of different forms of information, different media, different messages, which give you a way to evaluate the capacity and the honesty and the delivery of the government. And then also it's to do with the ways in which the individual has the skills, whether it's literacy, whether it's educational skills and cognitive thinking skills, to join the dots and to therefore link the performance of the government, not with blind trust, but with skeptical trust. So these factors are the keys which give us a reduction of perceptual error, make a more accurate judgment. And by the way, not just about trust, but about many aspects of things as well. These are broad factors which are critical for accurate rational judgments. And this just illustrates the link. As you get more plural sorts of information, and we have the freedom of expression and alternative sources of information on the vertical and trust across the bottom, you can see that by and large, you do get a more accurate perceptions. And countries like Uzbekistan are the lowest in freedom of expression, and Vietnam, which is a one-party state, and China. And those are the countries where it is low. So liberal democracy has a complex relationship to trust. It's not axiomatic, as people often assume. And I'll end the data analysis just with this slide. What we have is liberal democracy going across the bottom from low to high using the Variety of Democracy Index in the most recent period, 2000 to 2020. And then we also have trust in government. And what you can immediately see is that some countries have moderate levels of trust and high levels of democracy, a Norway, a Sweden, a Switzerland. But it's countries which are more autocratic, which have higher levels of government trust. And that's because democracy gives you a competing source of information, which means you get more skeptical trust, but not more blind trust. The conclusions. As I said, this is just a little part of this, and the evidence itself is unpacked in the middle section, along with the conclusions to talk about how we rebuild skeptical trust. And obviously the most important things in the theory is to strengthen individual educational capacities and knowledge, and then also to think about the information environment and the promotion of freedom of thought and expression. And these challenges might seem obvious, but in the age of misinformation and disinformation and media bubbles, which occur through the internet, then the solutions are far less clear-cut than might be assumed. So we should challenge normative assumptions. We need to understand where people get their judgments wrong. We need to explain what's driving that. And then we need to think about the risks. And I'll just end with thinking about President Trump, as many people do, when we're thinking about the problems of trust. Again, many commentators in the media, many commentators who are academics say, why did we get the rise of President Trump in the United States? What caused his popularity? And most people say, well, obviously, isn't it? It's people have no trust in Congress. They have no trust in the institutions. They have no trust in the parties. And that's true. And therefore it's cynicism, which means that people turn to Donald Trump. The opposite perspective, which is one which I'm arguing and which some of my previous book has, is that the problem is too much trust, too much blind trust. When Donald Trump says, what gets rid of the pandemic? It's not vaccines or wearing masks, it's ingesting bleach. And many other claims which he makes, such as the election was fraudulent and rigged and I won. When people believe the leader, when they're not skeptical, when they have no other information, but they're in bubbles, when they have partisan loyalties, which give them a way of thinking such that if they're in your party, you trust them. If they're in the opposite party, you don't. Blind trust, compliant trust is such a risk for democracy, such a risk for American society and intolerance, and for individuals who will not be served in their best interests without some level of skepticism. So that's my talk. I hope that that gave you thoughts and ways to think about some of these issues. And I look forward to hearing from you and to thinking about some of these complex questions about trust and trustworthiness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pippa, for this, Norris, for this wonderful talk. It is much appreciated, and I think it also connects to some of the discussions that we've had on the first day of the conference, discussions relating to the concept of risk, trust, and relationships. These were some of the big themes that we were talking about, and of course, your perspective adds another sort of disciplinary a framework for the discussion of solidarity and trust. So thank you very much for sharing your insights that are based on the World Values Survey and the European Values Survey. And I now turn to the audience, and I want to let everyone know that we will have a Q&A session now, and that you can either use the chat or the email to communicate, and your questions will reach me and I will pick them up and I will present them to Professor Pippa Norris. Okay, we have a few questions already in the chat, and some have to do with the methodology that you're using. Let me just start by asking you, apart from the level of the nation that you're here registering with the surveys that you've done, is there any way to get at sort of more specific subnational forms of distrust, cynicism, skepticism that make room for correlating specific groups, specific populations within that research design? This would be one question that I want to pose to you.
So would you like to go through questions sequentially, or would you like to gather a few and then I say 2 or 3 and then I could respond to them all?
Whatever you prefer. I can take up a second one and then we'll see. Yeah. So another question that has come up is a question that asks whether you establish a correlation between trust in government, so broadly speaking, and trust in science. And of course, that's a very current, occasion that leads us to question this connection. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So let me come back to you then, Heikki, and talk about that. So the great advantage of using the World Value Survey is we have about 600,000 cases now in the pooled survey, and we can look at it on any dimension, and we need multi-level analysis. So we can look at it, for example, in a global region. How does Africa compare with Latin America or Asia or Europe? We can look at it in terms of a country or a subnational region. For example, how does East Germany compare with West Germany? Or we can look at it in terms of social groups. And so, for example, how do ethnic minorities compare to the majority population, or women and men, et cetera, et cetera. Or we can look at it at the individual level. And what you've got is a series of Russian dolls when each of these can be used as your unit of analysis. What we find, however, with trust, by and large, is that most of these standard demographic predictors aren't actually really very good. There are some differences, clearly, by levels of income, by sex, by issues of race and ethnicity, by region, and so on and so on. But by and large, it's not really something which is strongly differentiated by most of those indicators. And we can do that when we look at any of the other classic work, which has really looked at all sorts of European social surveys, for example, which is a very rich source to understand each of those different individual factors. But most of them kind of come to a bit of a blank, except for education. And so education, we do know the more educated you are, the more you trust. Now, education is clearly related to socioeconomic status, and therefore to higher levels of income on average, and higher levels of class and occupation and things like that. So there is a group who tend to be more trusting than others in society, but it's very difficult then to work out whether it's education which is the driver, or whether it's economics and your economic position which is the driver. And I think, and I'm arguing in the book that it's education, which has an effect. Essentially, it's this: and we can go back to classically to philosophy and Thomas Hobbes. If you don't know anybody, if somebody is a stranger, the default function is not to trust them. You teach a kid not to trust strangers. And similarly, if you don't know much about a country, or you don't know much about a group, or a group of a minority group of refugees come into your country and you really don't feel that you have a lot of bonds and social links with them, then the default option is not to trust, because it's a risky situation. And why should you trust them? The more you know, the more you tend to trust. And another illustration of that to show you the power of this is racial attitudes in America, where there's urban areas and a highly diverse community. So Black and white and Hispanic and different groups from Mexico and from different Vietnamese communities and Korean communities all mixed. There's high levels of social and racial trust than there is in large parts of America, which are predominantly rural, isolated, and predominantly white. So there's this thing that the more you know, in general, the more you trust. So education is one of your best demographic predictors, along with things like, do you personally know people from a different group? Or do you personally have experience of working in a diverse community? And that in itself explains a lot of the other factors, for example, by generation or by age, because young people are growing up in very diverse and plural communities, whereas older generations often grew up in a much more homogeneous community. And And then there are other factors, obviously, but basically you can do a lot with the World Value Survey to explain and to understand all of these dynamics. Education for me is the key. And it's not that people are being indoctrinated to trust each other, but that by learning about other people, by having knowledge about other people, you're more confident in your judgments about whether you can trust them. And so if you don't know anything, you shouldn't trust them. If you do know something, it's a better way to create that link and that bond and so on. So that for me is how it works. And the second question about trust in science. So this is a big issue, of course. The latest survey, when it's just been done by the Pew Center in the United States, looks at trust in scientific authorities who are giving advice on COVID. And, you know, the best predictor, again, is not your age or your education or anything, it's your party. If you're Republican, trust went down in the Center for Diseases and other scientific authorities. And if you're a Democrat, trust went up. So elite cues can play a large role in these temporary fluctuations in trust as well. And that's basically because you'll say, I don't know anything about COVID, which I don't in some ways, or I don't know anything about the science, certainly behind testing, but I trust the leader. So that's a source of information that allows you to then trust, but it's not a very good source of information. It's better to understand the actual science behind it to form judgments of trust, if you can. But again, that often requires cognitive skills that all of us who aren't scientists don't have. But trust in government and trust in science, they're different dimensions, just like trust in banks or trust in NGOs or trust in social trusts. So, you know, my factor analysis, this has got 6 different levels of trust, different dimensions, trust in different agents, and you might well trust one more than another. I did an article years ago, a chapter for a book on trust in the healthcare system in America, and people trust their physician, the one they know. They don't necessarily trust the medical profession, or they certainly don't trust the healthcare industry. So people make these distinctions about the object of trust and the agent of trust quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So I have the next questions coming up. So one question regards the category of trust that you delineated in the beginning as being part of research designs in very different fields, ranging from social psychology to sociology to political science. And now the survey that you're relying on maintains that trust is a universal category. So even if you define trust, then there are certain norms that can be applied with the category of trust in kind of a global context. Question mark. That's one question. The second question is maybe more specific. Are governments aware, is one question, that education, as you claim, is the clue to trust? And do countries with more awareness of this fact have more trustworthy relations?
So again, good questions, Heike. And the first one, I'm assuming that, yes, these things are they should be connected. I decry the way in which the over specialization in the social sciences means that we're all working at separate tables, to use Gabriel Armand's words. We tend to go into more and more specialized areas. So people who look at interpersonal trust, or economists who look through experimental methods at game theory and relationship trust, don't necessarily make links to trust in broader institutions in society, whether it's the healthcare, whether it's the banks, or whether it's corporations or governments. And international trust is actually the least well represented. It's only recently that we've started to get better measures of things like trust in the United Nations and its agencies within the international community. We've had trust in the European Union, that's a good series, but not necessarily in all the other actors. So I think these things, theoretically, you can go up and become more abstract and understand the commonalities across them, and then go down to say, yes, but the information we have about each is very different. For example, the information you have about your friends and neighbors, you're going to learn from them if you live in an area for a long time, in a community, you know them very well. What do you actually know about the WTO? Or what do you know about the World Bank? Very little, except what you get through the media. So the theory is the same, the concept is the same, but then how it works and how much you would rely on information from one source versus another could be very different. If you want to have information about a corporation or a brand, you might go to one source. If you want to have information about the church or religious authorities, you might go to another. So there's still room for different disciplines to come together, but I think integrating them in our concepts, and building bridges between the disciplines, which is very much part of any academic academy, is something I think we need to do more of in general. We've just become too specialized. In our training as well, I think, again, it's something I decry, that younger scholars are often very narrowly focused on particular articles rather than a more synthetic approach through books, which give you a broader perspective. And then do governments know? Absolutely. What is propaganda? Propaganda is the manipulation of information. And so governments have always known that the more you can control the information, the more you can get compliance or obedience, blind obedience from your citizens. We're not teaching Putin or China anything that is new in this regard. But I think it is new in the sense that in the information environment, control of information is more complicated. It's both easier and more difficult. And I wrote about this years ago in my book, Digital Divide. In other words, it's easier in the sense that there are more sources of information. So potentially you've got more pluralism. When I wake up, I can read The Guardian and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the BBC and other European media as well. And so I can get an incredibly rich environment to judge anything. On the other hand, people don't. They have habits and they read one source, and particularly where the country is polarized and society is polarized, then they'll only read those particular links on a Facebook page, which will link to their own bubble. So it's both, I've always said the internet is both good and bad. It's positive in lots of ways, but it can be negatively reinforcing. And the more that the governments and other sources can control the information, then clearly the more problems there are for judging trust. And so if you have lots of control in your country, if you're in Russia, you should really be totally skeptical about everything. And you know, that's often what people said, that they read between the lines when they saw state media. They didn't quite believe it, didn't quite disbelieve it, but you know, they weren't too sure. So they just tended not to believe anything. It was a kind of an alienation from the media. I think East Germany was different because you always had the West German media coming across the border. So they had much more information than you did if you were part of Ukraine or Belarus or whatever. But control of information, we don't need to teach governments how to be more repressive and how they should control. What we need to work out is in a complex media environment, what's the actual modern standards that we can use to expand freedom of expression, particularly at a time when journalists are under threat. And they're being, and the governments have used the pandemic to control freedom of expression far more than they have in the past.
Thank you. There is a question that is maybe in a provocative way, I don't know, I'm assuming, pushing you a little bit with the argument about trust, wondering where there are certain conditions when trust does not matter. For example, in the voting booth, in family relations, etc. This is one question. And another question, let's do them in pairs again, is somewhat longer, and I will present it to you. So here a listener is stating that your model started on the micro level. From a law and economics perspective, trust facilitates market transactions by economizing on information costs. Although I agree on your analysis on the macro level, politics, etc., I think that the call for private information gathering in personal settings, contract negotiations, etc., to verify trustworthiness of agents is contradictory to conventional economic analysis of law. In other words, the primary advantage of interpersonal trust is that people need not spend on information costs. Rather, the legal system protects principals when their trust is disappointed by the agent. So given this difference, should we clearly distinguish between interpersonal and institutional trust? The latter which your study focused on.
So both good points. So trust in certain conditions. And again, I'm just going to refer to the general literature about the importance of trust. But again, skeptical trust, not just trust. So if it's talking about voting booth, does it help increase turnout? Absolutely. If you don't trust any of the parties or any of the media messages in the campaign, why bother to vote? If you don't believe that any of the companies are effective, or if you believe that you can't trust any of the other leaders, essentially, corrosive cynicism, particularly when it's associated with ineffective performance. In other words, cynicism which isn't based on simple emotive or affective orientations is really important. The second question is about the law. Excuse me. And here, remember, I'm arguing you've got two levels of judgment when you're making a trust judgment. One is about the agent or the agency. And so that is about, do they do what they say they're going to do? Has Chancellor Merkel had effective control of the pandemic? Has the mitigation strategies proved ones which are useful and have brought down cases and deaths, and healthcare has improved? So you've got individual judgments which require a lot of information to really be certain about that. Who knows? For example, maybe the pandemic would have gone down anyway. Maybe it was all to do with the European Union rollout of vaccinations. Maybe it was to do with the Pfizer Corporation who created the vaccine, not with the politicians or the leaders in the first place. So judging the individual accurately has high information demands. So what you can do is you can just trust the law, and you can just trust the guardrails. And that's a much more general form. And you say, I don't know whether I can trust a particular leader, but I can certainly say if they are incompetent, then they'll get voted out. Or if they found that they're giving recommendations, for example, if a scientific advisor gives recommendations which are inappropriate, then they'll be sacked, or they'll be, in other ways, reprimanded by the scientific community. And there'll be a peer-reviewed article which says, no, that's not the way to do things, etc., etc. So reputation will be damaged. So it's less information to trust the guardrails than it is to trust the individual. On the other hand, the guardrails may themselves be so general that they don't work. And again, take the case of a medical practitioner. You might well have a medical claim on a case where the surgeon didn't perform particularly well, and you say, well, that's okay, because the medical profession as a whole has certain standards. And if that doctor is found to fail, then the medical profession will step in and strip them of their license, or I can go to court and I can believe in the law and I can get recompense that way. Problem is that those guardrails are also fallible, particularly for the individual cases. They might work in general, they're probabilistic statements, but they won't necessarily have enough teeth to be effective for your one particular case or your one particular problem. So you still need to make judgments of the individual, as well as make judgments about the guardrails. And both of them require information costs, which are not easy, particularly in unfamiliar circumstances, and particularly, of course, in high-risk situations. You know, low risk, it doesn't matter. You go to the doctor for a flu shot, and it doesn't really matter who your doctor is, you're going to get a flu shot. You go to get your vax, and you'll get your vax. But if your life depends on it, and that skills and that capacity fails, then in that delegative situation, you've really got to be certain. So the information you collect has got to be a lot higher. And relying on blind trust in that case can be just disastrous, or relying on the medical council is disastrous for your personal interests. And it might work for society, but it won't work for you.
I have a couple more questions. And I want to also take this opportunity to send out kind of a last call for those in the audience. If you are still hesitant, please come on and send us your questions, and I will still take them from the chat or from the email. So this is my last call for all of you out there to ask your questions, raise your questions, make your comment. So one question is, does your research show any correlation of trust-distrust and privilege with reference to nationalism in Great Britain and the United States? And as a second question, you alluded to this a little bit, how your new book ties in with your older work on authoritarian populism. That's kind of related to this first question, but can you spell this out a little more explicitly? How did you move from analyzing authoritarian populism, we talked about Trump, to the concept of trust? What was sort of the path that took you to the current theme?
So again, good issues. And this is all to do with my my previous book, on which I did with Ron Engelhardt. And that really very much argued that it was lack of trust in political institutions and in parties and in mainstream politicians and in parliaments, which was rising a lot of the support for populist solutions. Because what populism is about saying you can't trust the establishment, those who are in power, those who are in elected office, those who are in public sector bureaucracies. You can't trust the experts, but you can trust the people. But in practice, what populism says is don't trust necessarily the people per se because they can't express themselves, trust the leader. So the strongman authoritarian uses populism in order to come in through the back door, if you like, and then seize power. And this is exactly the strategy which, of course, Donald Trump did. But also, I'd argue it was there as part of the ideas behind Brexit, where the idea was essentially you can't trust the European Union, and you certainly can't trust the established parties. So UKIP and the Brexit Party and Nigel Farage sought to exploit that in order to create greater international mistrust between Brits and continental Europeans, and then mistrusting also the European institutions like the Council and the Commission and things like that. So mistrust has always been at the heart of understanding the appeal of authoritarian populism. But in particular, also what drove me to this new book was the recognition that most of nearly all of our survey work has been done on first Western democracies. And so we have a lot of books which are about the crisis of legitimacy in Europe and in America and in Britain and so on. And then we've expanded it to the new democracies, i.e. they used to be called new, but they're not now. They're now electoral democracies. And so countries of Eastern Europe, Latin America, middle income and so on, and in Asia as well. But what we haven't done is really done as much survey research in strict authoritarian regimes. And in authoritarian regimes, the whole backsliding of democracy and the move towards electoral authoritarianism really requires us to think quite hard about what's going on. And there's three ways which electoral authoritarian countries like a Hungary now, or a Turkey, or a Venezuela, or any of the standard electoral authoritarian regimes work. You can appeal through force, and that is done. We know that military coups still continue, or at least the role of the police and the role of repression and throwing out your opponents, as we've seen in Nicaragua and various other draconian techniques. But it's not the mainstream way of controlling the situation as an authoritarian regime. You can use clientelism or corruption and bribery, and that's very common. And so you make sure that state assets are divided amongst your friends, oligarchs in Russia, other forms of corruption, which are very common. Or you can use legitimacy in an authoritarian regime, just as you can use legitimacy. And so, for example, President Putin is there partly because he has control of state resources and he's friends with all the oligarchs and works closely with them. And he has the army behind him and the police, but he also, and the intelligence service, but he also has a genuine popular legitimacy. And President Xi also has genuine popular legitimacy. And so do many other authoritarian regimes. It's not simply a false consciousness. I think it really exists. So we have to try and understand that. Why is it that you would trust? Now, maybe it's because you actually rather like authoritarian values yourself. And that again is part of the argument in my Cultural Backlash book, that not everybody does like democracy. And in particular, they like it as an idea, but in practice, they often feel it doesn't work very effectively. They don't like the messiness of democracy. They don't like the way in which it involves bargaining and compromise. And social intolerance means that people, in particular, have enemies within democracy. And polarization makes things worse. So genuinely, I think there is a tendency towards authoritarian values and a liking for authoritarian leaders and a trust in some authoritarian leaders, even though by many standards they're not trustworthy, because they are often very corrupt or they are often very repressive, and there's very few accountability mechanisms. So I think there's a larger research project here. And part of the reason I'm involved also in the World Values Survey and tried to expand it, we've added 12 countries to the World Values Survey just in this wave. And there are countries like Nicaragua, like Iran, like Zimbabwe, and Kazakhstan. And countries which are really very authoritarian, where it's quite difficult to get in, by the way, often to ask questions. Egypt is another. But we've got about 36 in general, authoritarian regimes in the World Values Survey. And so we can start to unpack what's going on in public opinion, in their values, as well as in their politics, as well as in other orientations. And just like Armand and Verba in the 1950s and 60s talked about the civic culture, so the book after this one on trust is I've tentatively called it the authoritarian culture, because I think it's a natural thing to think through where we can trust the data, and that's a big if, you know, because of the questions we mentioned earlier. But if we can trust some of the data, what causes popularity of some authoritarian leaders and parties and regimes? And it hasn't been looked at in as much detail as you might expect. There are case studies, obviously, lots of case studies of particular countries by specialists in Russia, by specialists in Venezuela, or specialists in Central and Eastern Europe. There's lots of attempts to look at new democracies and democracies which are somewhat unstable, but the real authoritarian, the stable authoritarian regimes, the Saudi Arabias of the world, very difficult to get in. But if we can do surveys, what's actually happening in the dynamics in those countries? I think it's an enormous agenda. And I think that's where I'm going to go. And that's once we finish the World Values Survey Wave 7. And what we also need is better measures of whether the public really supports strongman leaders. And we have very few. To give you a conclusion, a simple example in Heike in America, you might have thought as one of the long-standing democracies, there would be lots and lots of survey questions over time on American support for liberal democracy. Simple answer is there isn't. You can look as hard as you can in all the long time series, in the General Social Survey, in the Gallup series, in Harris, in data archives, in the ANES. Nobody bothered to ask much about support for democracy because they just kind of assumed it was in the air, everybody supported it, so they ask about lots of other things, right? Similarly, we need to ask about real support for authoritarianism. We need to take off our liberal biases and our liberal skew and say, in Egypt, why do people want to have a strong leader? They went from Mubarak to Modi with an interval with them, and yet they support a strong leader. They support the army. Why is that? And what's going on in other countries that reject democratic checks and balances and still want to retain a strong leader? Is it the search for stability and security? That's a large part of the answer. But I think there may be other things we still need to really understand. So that for me is where I hope we can all go and do some further research with lots of disciplines contributing to that one as well as a major area.
Okay. Are you willing to take two more questions, two last questions?
Yes, that was kind of a coda, but we can certainly add two more.
This is what I'm asking. So let's take the last two and then we'll close. Is there any evidence about the relationship between trust in business and national business performance? Question number one. And then the very last question that I think echoes with what you said earlier. Where do you situate conspiracy theories, QAnon, Pizzagate, etc. in your work? Are they a symptom of too little trust or too much trust?
Too much, but yes. So yes, I mean, you know, we mentioned that there's 3 different levels of trust, i.e. international, national, and then individual social trust. And then in the middle level, we've got our lovely series on do you trust big business in some countries or business in others. Anyway, we've asked that since 1981. So again, what you have to think, and do you trust the banks? So what you have to think is what's the appropriate performance indicators there? And we can think of all sorts, like there are all sorts of indices which have been constructed by Bertelsmann amongst others about business confidence and business efficiency and business corruption. So in every case, when we talk about measuring trust in X, in the agent, and then performance indicators, the performance indicators have to relate to the agent. So they'll be different. If you do trust the medical profession, there's a series of indicators about healthcare and health outcomes which you'd use. Do you trust university teachers or universities? There's a set of indicators about education. So the real difficulty is matching the right indicators, since there's so many, to that agent, and not simply kind of throwing everything into the wall. But we can certainly look at each of those separately. And similarly, trust in the United Nations. So here, one of the indicators is the performance on the SDGs. the SDGs are the key mission of the United Nations. How has that country performed on the SDGs? And we've got good evidence on that. How does that relate to trust in the United Nations? So for every level, you need the right indicators of performance. They're not generic. And then QAnon and conspiracies. So the biggest one, of course, right now is the big lie in America about the election. And this is other work I've been doing on election integrity, obviously. And of course, the problem is that it started a long time ago. I'd argue really in 2000, it's not new, with Florida, which increased mistrust on both sides and polarization of the lawyers. It has generally exacerbated over the years. It was there before 2016, before Trump, and it's got so much worse afterwards. And so right now, when you ask in YouGov polls, the latest ones, for example, were done in spring this year. Do you think that President Biden is the legitimate president, or was the electoral fraud determinative? Basically, 8 out of 10 Republicans and 8 out of 10 Trump supporters say they don't believe that President Biden was legitimate. And they believe that there was enough fraud to determine the outcome. And that's so worrying, because what we're really talking about there is compliance. They believe this. It's an assumption that they're cynical about the election, but they believe the lie that, you know, that was promulgated not just by President Trump now, but by leading Republicans in Congress and by state laws, which are now changing. There's over 400 bills in the state laws which are proposing to restrict voting rights, according to the Brennan Center. And it's not simply voting rights. There's also laws which are going to restrict the vote count. And that's fundamental to the outcome. And they're pressuring local officials to be much more partisan in their appointments. So I have a rather negative and black assessment. It's a rather bad way to end on the role of conspiracy theories and this particular conspiracy theory in America, because I really see there's a fundamental problem and it's very difficult to know how to get out of it. Democrats are pushing laws which are more liberal, more convenience voting, and that's great if you live in Massachusetts. It doesn't work if you live in Georgia, or you live in Arizona, or you live in many other states. The Supreme Court has also, in its recent decisions just this week, held the new laws in Arizona, for example, which weakens voting rights, the 1965 Act. So the only real hope is to pass what's known as HR 1. It's called For the People's Act, and it's been passed through Congress, but it's been filibustered in the Senate, and it's a Democrat set of comprehensive reforms for elections, things like independent electoral commissions, things like strengthening federal standards of elections, having a voter register, which is nationwide, et cetera, and improving campaign money. But you can't get HR 1 through under the Senate unless you get rid of the filibuster. And the Democrats have not been willing, particularly 2 members of the Democratic Senate, to abandon the filibuster, which is just a rule, it could be got rid of. And until you do that, you can't pass that legislation. And even then, you're going to have problems trying to get every member of the Democratic Party in the Senate is in favor of HR 1. But whether or not it's going to stand up in the courts, if it got passed, is another matter, particularly given the skew in the Supreme Courts and the minority of liberal judges. So conspiracy theories are poison to democracy, and they're evident everywhere due to media bubbles, and they are made worse by compliant trust, believing the leader. And I have a wonderful little graph just showing that. If you look at, for example, the lies which Trump told, we used to call them mistruths or misspeak or whatever it is, but they're lies essentially. The Washington Post documented through its fact check the number of lies throughout his administration. It went up and up and up. At the end of it, there was something like 20,000, which they documented during his 4 years in office. Levels of honesty and trust have been asked in YouGov polls for The Economist every couple of months, and you can document them over the whole period, and they're flat amongst Republicans. In other words, the Republicans did not believe. They said, yes, he's honest, yes, he's truthful. And there could not be a clearer example of compliance due to partisan blinders than that particular. Now, it's only 40% of the public said that, i.e. the 40% that support Trump, and sometimes it's even lower. Right now, only 25% of Americans identify with the Republican Party. But It's enough of a minority that they can cause havoc, and Republicans control the majority of states' houses. They're likely to get control of the House and the Senate in the next 2022 midterm elections, just by historical records. And that means that we're heading for really uncharted waters for 2024. Mm-hmm. If you get rid of trust, if you have too much compliance, it's a problem. Strongman leaders can take over.
So on this bleak note, we have to conclude. There are no more questions, and I want to thank you again for so patiently answering all of those that came your way.
My pleasure.
Thank you again for taking the time for this conversation, for giving your talk. And we will now go offline. I will say also good evening, have a nice rest of the evening to our audience. And we will reconvene with the conference tomorrow afternoon. And until then, take care. I will see you then. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Heike.